This is episode 393 of Jumblethink.
T minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Welcome to Jumblethink, where we interview dreamers, makers, innovators, and influencers all about their journey of turning dreams and ideas into reality. Along the way, we're going to share some tips on how you can turn your own dreams and ideas into reality too. Our guest on today's show is Scott Hershovitz. More about Scott in a moment. Whether you're a new listener or a longtime fan, if you've never subscribed to Jumblethink, now's the time to do it. Head on over to wherever you listen to podcasts, search for Jumblethink, and click that subscribe button. To make it even easier, if you head on over to jumblethink.com, you'll find links to places like Apple Podcasts, Pandora, Spotify, and more. Go subscribe to the show and never miss another great conversation. Now let's join today's conversation. Hey there, friends. Welcome to Jumblethink. My name is Michael Woodward. I am your host. We have a great conversation lined up for you in a moment, but before we dive into that, I wanted to tell you about something free that we have for you. It's called The Dreamer's Guide to Micro Experiments. It's an easy-to-use tool to help you in the process of turning an idea or a dream into reality. If you head on over to jumblethink.com, there's a link that will pop up that you can download that guide for free. I encourage you to go check it out. It's a really helpful tool for all of our dreamers and idea makers out there. Now, our guest today is Scott Hershovitz. He's the director of Law and Ethics program and professor of law and philosophy at the University of Michigan. There is a lot about his story we're going to get into, but one of the things I'm super excited about is a new book he has out called Nasty, Brutish, and Short: Adventures in Philosophy with My Kids. Why don't we just go ahead and join the conversation with today's guest, Scott Hershovitz. Hey, Scott, thank you so much for joining us here on Jumblethink.
Thank you so much for having me. Thrilled to be here.
Now, I first heard about you through an NPR show that you had done, and it was a fascinating conversation. I think it was Science Friday or some such thing. And they were doing all kinds of conversations, as they do every Friday, that are a little less off their traditional interview and more into the concept of ideas or science or philosophy. And I'm sitting in a Hardee's drive-through listening to the interview. I can think of it and remember it vividly and just going, this is a guy I have to have on Jumblethink. So I've been looking forward to this conversation for a couple of weeks, and I'm so glad to have you on.
Well, that's awesome to hear. And actually, I haven't been on Science Friday yet. So if the Science Friday guys are listening, totally available. But I did do an NPR show, with one of the local San Francisco stations. I bet that's what you were listening to.
Yeah. It's the joys of Sirius Radio or XM Radio or whatever they're calling it now. Hearing the best of across the country. And the other reason I love having you on is we had a guest a year or 2 years ago. His name is Ed Freeman. He teaches on philosophy also, but he is like you, not a philosophy, like he works in kind of a unique space of philosophy. He works in the world of economics and microeconomics and incorporates philosophy through business. You are in the space of law and ethics. So talk to us a little bit about how philosophy and law and ethics all kind of marry together and how that you got peeked into this space.
Yeah, so I sometimes feel like I found a loophole in life. I get to be a philosopher, but I get to teach in a law school, and that comes with some benefits. You get paid like a lawyer. You got a lawyer's teaching load, but it's a natural combination because law raises lots of philosophical questions. And in fact, some of the questions that I am thinking about in Nasty, Brutish, and Short are the kinds of questions I talk to my law students about. So what are the purposes of punishment? How should we respond when one person wrongs another? Is revenge ever justified? If revenge is a bad idea, what's a good substitute for revenge? These are issues that you think about in law school, and it helps a lot of times to have philosophers' perspectives on these kinds of questions.
Yeah, you mentioned the book Nasty, Brutish, and Short: Adventures in Philosophy with My Kids. I have it right here. I've been reading it. I'm loving every moment of the book. And if you're listening right now, we're also going to give away a copy of the book. So make sure you head over to jumblethink.com and you'll find a place where you can sign up for the free giveaway of that book. If you don't win, you have to still get the book because it's awesome. You are speaking from experience. You have two kids, right?
Yeah, I've got two boys. They're a little bit older now than they are in the book. Rex is 12 and Hank is now 9. But the book is really about kind of the philosophical questions and conversations and arguments we had between when they were, say, 3 and 10.
Yeah, I love it. I have 2 daughters. Our daughters are now just turned 9 and just turned 5. So it's like they just had birthdays recently. We're in that fun stage where you get the random questions or funny things that they say, and you get to explore those. And one of the things you say in the book is that good things happen when you get a kid excited about a conversation. I think that statement is probably my favorite statement in the entire book, simply from the standpoint of, as a parent of 2 young girls, there are times where I'm just like, would you stop talking? Would you let me alone? We're trying to have a conversation, mom and dad, all that kind of stuff. And I think it's important for us to remember that we can foster this or we can shut it down. And so that spark of interest, why is that so important to nurture?
So I think that you really want to show your kids that you're interested in them and you're interested in ideas. You're interested in their ideas and you're interested in their thoughts, because it helps them hold on to this sense of wonder and curiosity that they have about the world and their willingness to think things through and to share their ideas. So, so you quoted that passage that good things happen when you get a kid excited about a conversation. I didn't do this 100% of the time with my kids, but if they said something cool or interesting, I was going to communicate overwhelming enthusiasm. That's the most interesting thing I've heard. Tell me more about that, because the more excited you seem, the more excited they get about sharing their ideas and thinking things through.
I love that. And one of the things you said in the interview that I thought was very powerful is that we think, as we look at this book, that these have to be long conversations. These have to be drawn out. They have to go deep. They have to, it's 100% in. I'm going to be completely focused on my kid. But anyone that has children knows that that's just not realistic to keep a kid's conversation. And so I think it's easy for us as adults to go, oh, this is a distraction at this moment. But on the flip side, to say, oh, I'm going to try to get more out of them and dig. So where's that healthy balance of good conversation?
Yeah. So I say at one point in the book, you shouldn't imagine that is, say, it's a book about conversations about life's mysteries with my kids, but we're not sitting by the fire, sipping brandy, talking for hours, like we're in a seminar room. It's often just these quick conversations throughout the day. And, with a little kid, they might just last for a minute or two, but they add up over time, especially if you revisit the questions. So that's the strategy I often like to give parents is, hey, maybe you don't have time to talk about this now, or maybe you've got time to talk about this now, but it's just for a minute or two, or maybe you talk about it now for a minute or two, but your kid loses interests, but you think, no, that was cool. Let's try and talk about that again. So just bring it back up. Right. And I try to bring it back up at the quiet parts of the day. For us, that's often bedtime. And my kids are up for conversations at bedtime because they're trying to extend the length of the day and avoid lights out. And so, there's a story in the book of my 4-year-old wondering one night at dinner whether he was dreaming his entire life. We probably talked about that for 3 or 4 minutes when he first asked the question. But then every once in a while, he'd bring it back up or I'd bring it back up. And that conversation extended for years, really, in bits and pieces. And as people who read the book will find out, had lots of depth to it. And also he ended up with a kind of really interesting and surprising take on the possibility that he was dreaming his entire life.
Well, there's a study that was done years ago, and I don't remember who did it, but it was with kids, and they were looking at the color of the sky. That simple question, what color is the sky? And every kid that most of us know will say the color of the sky is blue. But what they were studying was if you take down the presupposition based on being told that, or being like, oh, the sky's blue, you get richer answers because they'll be like, oh, it's kind of a wispy gray, or it's it's dark. It's, and those kind of questions. And so I feel like as a parent, what you're saying is nurture what they're exploring instead of giving them answers.
Yeah. So, I don't know the science behind whether the sky is blue, but I heard the same thing you did. And so I would run this experiment on my kids before anybody has said to you, the sky is blue. Let me ask you what color the sky is. And you actually do get a more interesting range of answers when they're very little, before they've learned that when you draw the sky, you draw it blue. So it's a kind of interesting question here of, if you don't expect that the sky is blue, what's your perceptual experience of it? And I'm not sure if scientists have been trying to get a grip on that. But, I think that when kids ask different kinds of questions. Sometimes kids are asking, say, scientific questions, and you know the answer. And then I think it's okay to tell them the answer. Sometimes they're asking a scientific question, you don't know the answer. And then I think you say, oh, we'll investigate this together. Let's see if we can find out why clouds are white, or whatever the question is. But a lot of times they're asking questions that are less scientific and more philosophical, right? So this question of, am I dreaming my entire life, or does God exist? Or I asked my mother when I was little, do you see red the same way I see red?
Yeah.
And so I encourage parents to really lean into these weird questions, and these deeper questions, not to think of, I have to provide an answer, but to think, I get to have a conversation with my kid about this. And I think there's something really lovely about doing philosophy with kids, because you probably don't know the answer either, right? So you may have views about whether God exists, but you're probably a little bit unsure of yourself. Or, I tell the story, this one girl asked her mother, why do the days keep coming?
I love that question.
Really interesting question. And the mother tried to explain the rotation of the earth and give the scientific explanation. That wasn't what she was interested in.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think take that moment to explore, what's bothering that kid. Is it coming from a place of anxiety, right, about what the world's throwing at you? Really just be willing to think with your kid rather than teach them something.
I remember you shared that story, do you see, I think it was red the same way I see red, that you asked your mom at a very young age. And I think that that's a fascinating question, because often we're viewing that question through our own bias or interpretation, and not really answering or getting to the root of what they're truly asking. So when we are doing this, what are some simple things we can do as parents to really understand what our child's asking? Or maybe it's a child of our cousin or whoever it might be.
Right.
How can we explore that and not incorporate our own bias into the discovery process?
So I think stopping and listening, and then before you provide an answer, question them and see what they think. Yeah. Right. So, when your kid says, does God exist? Don't share your view right away. Right. Ask what they think, or maybe share a range of people's views without sharing what your view is. Some people think this, some people think that. What do you think? Especially I tell the story of a little boy named Ian in the book. There was a philosopher named Gareth Matthews, who was, I think, maybe the first person alive to the idea that kids are really talented philosophers. And he collected stories from parents. He went to schools and had conversations with kids himself. And the mother of a little boy named Ian told him the following story, that they'd had guests over for dinner, and there were 3 kids in that family, and just Ian and his family, and all the kids sat down to watch a television program. And Ian missed his favorite show because the other kids picked what to watch. And after that family went home, Ian said to his mother, why is it better for 3 people to be selfish than for one person to be selfish?
Interesting.
I just love that question. It's so simple and it's subversive. It's like a challenge to the idea that a lot of economists have, that we should try to maximize the satisfaction of people's preferences, saying, hey, why do our preferences matter if they're just selfish? It's also like a challenge to democracy. If you put it to a vote, the 3 kids are going to outweigh the 1 kid. But if the 3 kids are just being selfish, why does the fact that there are more of them count for more? I think it's a really good question. And Ian's mom was puzzled by it. She didn't quite know how to answer. And I think that's where I want people to stop and be puzzled with your kid about it. And instead of saying, oh, right, when there's a thing to do, ask your kid, hey, how do you think it would be fair to decide what television show to put on, and make it more of a conversation than you're sharing your sort of preset view?
Yeah. I think maybe it's a guy thing, maybe it's a generational thing, maybe it's, I don't know. But we often want to solve the question or answer the question. And it seems like what you're saying here is it's okay to not come to the conclusion, but to go to a place of more discovery.
So that's how I think of philosophy, which is to say, people have been asking same sorts of questions for thousands of years in some instances. And a lot of people think, oh, philosophy doesn't make progress. And I think that's a mistake.
Yeah.
It makes progress in the sense that our understanding gets deeper over time. We see more about the possible answers. We learn more about their benefits and drawbacks. We see why the hard issues are hard. Sometimes we may arrive at an answer that we feel good about. We can explain why. But I think there's value in just deepening our understanding. What's confusing here and understanding why it's confusing is a way of knowing more about the world, even if we don't know what the answer is yet.
Now, the book is broken into 3 sections with multiple chapters within each. The first section being making sense of morality, making sense of ourselves, and then the final section, making sense of the world. And I want to point out that I think it's easy to say that a child has simplistic views of the world. It's easy to downplay the value to the conversation that they can bring. But the chapters in these sections are not light sections. They are deep conversations. And it's interesting. I guess there's 2 parts to this question. One, how can we better understand the depth of value and information of what our children are bringing to the conversation? But also, how can we get to a place where we can even be changed by what they're asking or the conversations that they're having? Because I think that will inherently happen, because if you're exploring these questions, if you're looking into these deep sections of life and humanity and of the world around us, then inherently those simple questions, or questions that aren't as simple as we try to make them from kids, will actually change us too in the process.
Yeah, so it's worth thinking, I think, about why kids make such good philosophers. And I think there's really 2 reasons. One is they show up in the world and they're new and they're just confused by almost everything they encounter. They're trying to make sense of it. And so they ask questions that grown-ups wouldn't think to ask. They don't yet know what the standard explanations of things are. They don't know what adults take for granted, or what questions adults don't think are worth spending time on. They're also just kind of fearless about the way they think things through, because they're not yet worried about what other people think of them. So they don't worry about seeming silly. Silly is kind of the business they're in. They're not afraid of being wrong. They're wrong all the time. And so they generate their own arguments, they come up with their own ideas, and they're willing to share them. I think those give them advantages as philosophers. The claim isn't that kids are better philosophers than adults, right? Adults have their own skills. We have more information about the world. We can think about things in a more disciplined, sustained way. And so the thought isn't like, oh, recapture what you were as a kid exactly. It's to recognize that there's something we can get from kids, the sense of curiosity and wonder and the questions. And then one thing I think adults can do is take some of these questions that kids have and really think about them in the grown-up way. And so for those that haven't read the book yet, the chapters kind of start with stories about my kids. It might be a conversation with a kid or something a kid does that raises a question in philosophy. And then they proceed to explore those questions in conversation with the kids, but also with the assistance of a wide cast of grown-up philosophers, right? From ancient history and people working on contemporary questions today. And really my ambition here is like partly to get people to talk to their kids differently, but partly also just to help them reconnect with the wonder they had as kids and want to think through these issues again as adults.
Yeah. And I love that you use these words, wonder and curiosity, time and time again. And when I was a kid, probably like you, we didn't grow up with the internet. We grew up maybe with a handful of channels on TV, let alone access to everything else. And so, I think of like hanging out even as an early teen or even in my mid-teens, sitting around with friends and having these conversations about topics and ideas or things that we have to fill in the gaps of not having the knowledge accessible to us.
Right.
Should we be doing that more, exploring things without trying to find the answer right off the bat?
I think so. I mean, I think that we're just used to like the immediate availability of information and, like checking in on Twitter and getting hot takes and, arguments, if you can call them that fit in 280 characters. And I don't think that's in the long run, like good for our capabilities as thinkers or good for our culture for that to be the kind of most common or deepest way in which people engage. I'm a little bit hopeful. I mean, like, we're sort of struggling, I think, like all families, especially in the pandemic, with the fact that a lot of our rules around screen time got adjusted or went out the window, and our kids are deep in their devices. You know, I'm a little bit heartened sometimes. Like, my kid will go to the pool with friends and he'll come home with a question. I guess it was going around the internet for a while, like, is a hot dog a sandwich?
Yeah.
And that's just actually like a question in what philosophers call analytic philosophy. It's conceptual analysis. What is a sandwich? What is a hot dog? And are these is a hot dog an instance of a sandwich? It's not the most pressing question in philosophy, but I really love that these kids just sort of like dug deep and had arguments with each other. They had a little bit of a pre-internet experience inspired by an internet meme. So maybe there's some hope.
You know, there's a guy named James Altucher. He's a podcaster, a business guy, does a lot. And he talks about working the idea muscle or working our thought process. And it sounds like, you know, we overthink. There's a simple question. Is a hot dog a sandwich? And we think, oh, well, that's a question that doesn't really matter. But it seems like those trivial thought processes, those trivial arguments, those conversations actually can help give us more resources and tools and skills to actually go deeper into the philosophical unraveling of our thoughts and really coming to critical thought and coming up with creative or new concepts.
So I think that's 100% right. And I think actually one of the reasons I love doing philosophy in a law school is because you see that these kinds of conversations actually matter to the way that the world goes in very concrete ways. So there was a recent court decision that said, for the purposes of a particular statute, a bee is a fish.
Yeah.
And that sounds weird, but when you dig into the decision, you can see there were reasons for understanding the reference to fish in this statute to be broad enough to encompass bees. These questions can turn out, you know, so often these kinds of conversations of, well, let's try and understand this idea better, this concept better, they're some of the most important things in our lives, right? Like what a marriage is and who's allowed to get married is a big, important question. Even if what a sandwich is and whether a hot dog counts as one is not the biggest important question. When you work through questions like that, you're exercising, as you put it, the muscles that you use to answer the more important versions of those questions.
We're going to take a break right here, and in a moment, we'll be back to continue today's conversation. Many individuals and businesses struggle with something very, very significant. That is, how do I tell the right story to reach my audience to sell a product, a service, a message, or a specific idea that I want to get out into the world? Here at Jumblethink, we've helped hundreds of clients do just that, to craft the right story, the right narrative to not only reach your audience, but also to reach deep into their heart and connect with the pain and issues that audience member is facing. I would love to help you in the journey of crafting the message that is right for your brand, but also right for your audience to help you reach your dreams and ideas through story. If you want to start that journey, if you want to have a conversation to help you craft the right story for your brand, reach out to me. hello@jumblethink.com. That email comes right to me, and I'd love to have that conversation to help you craft the right story, to tell the right story, to reach your audience. So drop me that email, hello@jumblethink.com, and let's start the conversation about telling the story that's going to change your brand. Now let's jump back into today's conversation. Yes, your son Hank, that's the story. He was talking about Trump specifically, and he was talking about how one side says that Trump is all lies. The other side says Trump's the best thing since sliced bread. Probably neither is true, but he said there's no middle. And I love that how he explored what that meant for him. And he was looking into relative thought and philosophy there and relativism. versus objective truth. Talk to us a little bit about that in the middle, that place of there has to be a judge or something.
Yeah. So it was shortly after the January 6th attack on the Capitol. Trump was still president. And my older son, Rex, asserted one night at dinner, he said, Trump is a bad president. And Hank said, well, he's a bad president to us, but he's a good president to the people that like him. And I said, Hank, do you mean that the people that like him think he's good, but that they're wrong about that? And he said, no, I mean that we think he's good and they think he's bad. And there's nothing in the middle that says who's right. And I heard that very much, as you say, as a kind of assertion of relativism, that they have their truth and we have ours. And there's just nothing that decides between us. And I actually followed up with him. I wanted to see how deep the view went. I said, Hank, if we go outside and I say it's raining and you say it's not, is one of us right and the other wrong? And he said, it's raining for you, but not for me. And I found that a little worrisome. I thought, oh, no, like, wait a minute. Some things, like whether it's raining outside, it feels to me like there's definitely objective truth about that. And I think it's an interesting question whether there are also objective truths about evaluative judgments, like Donald Trump is a good president, Donald Trump is a bad president, Mozart is better than Beethoven, right? So philosophers argue about whether these kinds of evaluative claims can have any objectivity about them. I think the answer is not all of them. But many of them, I do think, have an objective quality to them. But I thought it was really like I just kind of dropped back and I let my two kids argue for a while. And Rex was defending the view that there's objective truth, and Hank was pushing back and defending a kind of relativism. And I just thought it was really striking. These kids were, let's see, it would have been they were 11 and 8. When they were having this argument. And I think most people don't think of little kids as having arguments like that, but they're totally capable. And I think they do. And a lot of parents just don't notice.
Yeah. And that's a question I have. There's a lot of debates in society right now. A lot of questions about whether it's a viewpoint on morality or absolute truth versus relative truth. There's a lot of questions about this in society. So how do we balance that when we have something like, let's say, the Trump thing, where the January 6th thing, absolutely wrong. It shouldn't have happened. It was a bad thing. And there is a sense of absolute truth in that. But there's also people who say, well, that's not what it should have been. And they interpret it differently. How do we get to this place where it seems like there's this question of my truth versus the truth in some cases? So how do we weigh that? How do we really adjust for that in society?
So I think that this idea that each person has their own truth is corrosive.
Yeah.
And it's partly, it's corrosive of society, that if we're going to live together, make decisions together, we need to see ourselves as mutually accountable for providing evidence and defending our views. So I try to raise my kids that way, right? So Americans like to say, I'm entitled to my opinion. And I think that's not how my house works. I mean, like there's a narrow sense in which it's true, which is to say nobody's permitted to beat your opinion out of you. But if you have an opinion, you better be prepared to back it up with your evidence and your arguments. And we try and teach our kids that, make a claim, be prepared to defend your claim. I hope that more people would take that attitude and would be, and to teach their kids to take that attitude, and will not be willing to rest on the sort of easy, well, that's my view, because that cuts off conversation and it makes it harder for us to find ways to live together.
In universities, we hear about kind of like this philosophy of groupthink, that universities are putting out students that have a specific worldview, a specific philosophy. And so there are sectors or schools in which it's like, you have to align to my thought, whether it's student to student or faculty to a student or some such thing. And so is that one healthy? And is that what you're seeing as somebody inside the institutions of education? Are you seeing the same things? Does that worry you? Are you optimistic, pessimistic about the future?
That's not been my experience of the very broad and diverse public institution at which I teach, right? So I just had the most amazing experience. In a seminar this past semester, I taught a seminar. It was called Life, Death, Love, and the Law. And the idea was, let's think about these really contentious ethical and legal issues that arise at the beginning and end of life. So a little more than half the semester was talking about issues related to reproduction, centrally abortion. And then the second half of the semester was talking about issues related to death, assisted suicide, and euthanasia. And my classroom had students with a lot of different backgrounds, with a lot of different personal experiences in this space, and with a lot of different political views. But I said up front, right, this is a space, like this class is a room where we're going to read deeply and think deeply, and we're going to challenge each other, but we're especially going to challenge ourselves. And I tried to set some norms about how the conversation was going to go, that we're going to listen. If somebody says something that we disagree with, even something that makes us mad, we're going to remember, like, look, that person probably has a story and a life history that brought them up to holding that view. And the thing to do in this room is let's try and understand that. And then let's try and communicate why we might think differently. And the class, the students were just so wonderful about that. And I do think they all walked away understanding each other and the issues in a much deeper way. And I think some of them ended up with more nuanced, complicated views as a result. And I think the real interesting question is, like, how could we take the kind of understanding and openness that you can manifest in a classroom like that and bring it out to the broader culture? But, I read these stories that people like to write about how, like, you just got sort of indoctrination happening on college campuses, and maybe somewhere there are such college campuses, but my students come from a wide variety of backgrounds, and they challenge each other and they challenge me constantly. So that's not been my experience.
I want to go a little bit further in that our society seems to be very divided on topics and things. And I love the example you gave here about your classroom and that specific class that you were teaching and how you navigated it. How can we as a society get back to a place of productive debate, productive conversations, really exploring ideas that are looking at with honest eyes? How can we get to a place of health back in that? Because it's definitely not going to come in the space of politics. Both sides are like, hey, let's just shout louder. That's not going to solve the problem. You look at a lot of the divisiveness in society, and there's a lot of good things saying, but it's just everyone's shouting over each other. So how do we get back to a place of health?
So I don't know that a philosopher is the right person to ask that question, actually. It may require the expertise of political scientists or sociologists or psychologists. I do have some suspicions. In an earlier life, I worked in politics and I studied political science. And I think
I want to pause you there, right? You didn't just work at it. You were a clerk to Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
That's right. Although I don't think of that as one of my political jobs, interestingly.
Okay. Well, it's in the space of our government. So I kind of put it in that same.
Definitely in the space of government. But even before that, I worked on some political campaigns through college. And I think that political primaries are really corrosive, coupled with gerrymandering of political districts, so that the only risk that a lot of our representatives face of losing an election right now is in a primary where the sort of most committed ideologues will be the people participating. And that, I think, drives people, drives our politicians to the extreme and creates this dynamic where fewer and fewer of our leaders feel an incentive to try and speak to a broader range of people, to capture people in the middle. And so I think that we underestimate sometimes the influence that the structure of our political system has on the outcome of our politics. So I think we do need some structural reform to move away from the extreme gerrymandered districts, and maybe even to move away from primary systems. But it's hard for individuals, right, to make that kind of difference. And so I think that we can try and make space in our lives for more engagement with people that we disagree with. and to have more conversations across these divides, whether they're at the Thanksgiving dinner table where you meet your cousins who you know think differently than you do, or whether it's just getting involved in civic organizations that are going to bring you in contact with a broader range of people. I think you're absolutely right. We do have to find ways to engage each other without shouting at each other.
Now, I mentioned that you worked for Justice Ginsburg, and I just have to ask, she was such a heavyweight in our judicial system, a person who had very clear, definitive thought on ideas and concepts, but also was compassionate to listen. What was your experience like working for her and working in that environment?
So I think she had a real knack. She's taking some heat lately for this, but I think unjustifiably so. She's taking some heat because of her sort of famous friendship with Justice Scalia. But, people are wondering, well, what did that get her? And I think that, she had an approach to the world, which was she was very clear about what she believed, but she was not going to dismiss or disengage from people who thought differently than her. And she was constantly trying to think, how do I bring more people around to the view that I hold? So I think one thing that's sort of lost on people today about Justice Ginsburg is that she was an extraordinarily successful lawyer, a leader of the legal fight for women's equality, and sort of akin to the role that Thurgood Marshall played on the legal side of the civil rights movement. She played that kind of organizing role in the litigation that was advancing the cause of women's equality in the courts. And she was extraordinarily strategic about the kinds of cases that she picked and the sequence in which they brought those cases to try and move people along step by step. So one of her very early cases that she argued at the Supreme Court as a lawyer was a sex equality claim, but brought on behalf of a man, right? Because she thought this is going to be a way of getting the men on this court to take the idea of sex equality seriously. And then down the road, I may come back with a woman who's a plaintiff, but they'll have started to think about sex equality and they'll have started to write some things and opinions that I can point to and be like, hey, remember when you said this, right? It applies here too. And so she was an optimist about people. She believed that she could persuade them, but she also understood that her hope of persuading people was by engaging in them, not dismissing them or shouting them down or insulting them.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that being intentional about our actions, I think there's a lot of people, I say this often, I don't consider myself a thought leader. I consider myself more of a conversationalist, trying to have good conversations with ideas that I think are worth sharing. We love ideas. We love dreams. We love people who are chasing those things and creating them. I'm not a thought leader. So I'll just put that out there. But there are a lot of thought leaders who simply don't even take time to think and be intentional. We have some great thought leaders who are putting out some really amazing content. But in the content creator space, it's just, I don't think everyone does that. They just go, I'm just going to say stuff. You say in the book, and I think it's a really powerful thing, the philosopher has to say what he thinks, even if he doesn't think others will like what he has to say. How do we do that well?
So I think that as a kind of commitment to honesty on my part, if I'm going to do my job well, which is to say, I'm going to, a good philosopher shows you his homework. Right? Here's the question. Here's how I'm thinking it through. I'm not hiding any of the arguments. I'm trying to lay it all out there so you can see where you agree or where you disagree. And I'm going to tell you at the end what I think the answer is. But by having shown you my homework along the way, I'm giving you the opportunity to say, here's where I think you went wrong, or this is why I disagree. It's just occurring to me that, as you think about like thought leaders that maybe don't take a lot of time to think, there's another philosopher who I actually discuss in Nasty, Brutish, and Short in the chapter on knowledge, T. Nguyen, who has written a lot about the kind of gamification of our communication, right? So the way that like Twitter as a structure or Facebook or Instagram as a structure changes the way we talk to each other. And so like we're all after likes, like you tweet something and then you come back later and you want to see that like, people have liked it or people have retweeted it. And that's kind of like validation for you. But of course, the things that people are likely to like or to retweet are the things that like pack some kind of emotional punch, right? You're dunking on somebody. And so I completely agree with you. Is like there's just like these platforms structure a lot of the way we communicate in a way that discourages thought and discourages openness and engagement, and instead encourages like the too quick, too easy joke or insult that actually makes it harder to learn and understand each other.
You know, I love what you said there. As a philosopher, you have to show how you got there. You have to work through that process. I often say about the internet, I work in the space of tech. We do big projects for big corporations and the world of web and communication. And as a person in the industry, I don't like social media, honestly. And one of the things I say often is social media is false intimacy without a sense of responsibility. And it's this place of like, I'm sharing things that are deep. I'm sharing things that I value, but there's not the closeness of relationship. So as you process ideas, obviously with a child that is your child, you have an intimacy with them because you are their parent, or you are somebody, an aunt or an uncle, or a person in their church or their synagogue, or you're involved in their life. And there's this place of closeness and responsibility. How do we process that better to be responsible for our thoughts and ideas, but also foster that place of healthy shepherding, if you will, of how our kids really process and how they grow and how they mature in those processes?
Yeah. So, if the answer is how do we do it online, I just don't know how we do it online. Like not with the kind of like structure that these platforms have. Like you're completely right. Sometimes you appear to have intimacy, but you don't really. Sometimes you appear to be anonymous, but you're not really. So, and these things I think lead to all kinds of bad behavior and distorted exchanges. With my own kids, right, I think that turning off the devices and finding, which we sometimes find challenging. Our kids call us out on it, and they're right to do it. And now that Rex is an adolescent and has a phone of his own, we're back in the other role. But making space for conversations but also conversations that could be about anything, right? So one thing we did at the start of the pandemic, this is the benefit of being married to a social worker, is we had a dinner early on, and then we repeated this sort of like periodically, where, as the world was changing around us, we went around the table and we took turns saying like, here's something that I'm scared about, and here's something that I'm excited about, or maybe something that's going to be an opportunity to do something different or new or better because the world is changing. So like, now I'm going to be at home a lot. What is it that what's a good thing about that? And I think that exercise was really good, both because we heard what our kids were concerned about, but also because it reframed it a little bit for them, that maybe this doesn't just have to be a bad thing. Maybe we could find something good in that. Yeah. So, I think that coming up sometimes with a sort of structure for those conversations and then also participating in it encourages your kids to participate in it.
You close the book with a chapter in which you call How to Raise a Philosopher, which I think is a really important chapter in the book. But it I think invokes a bigger question, is that, often we think of philosophy as unattainable. It's like, I've got to look at these great writers and throughout history, and I've got to have all this knowledge. And we kind of discredit that philosophy is something that's actually a part of our everyday life. But philosophy is both in the mundane and the very significant. And it seems like we've discredited something that's really significant in society. And everyone at some level is a philosopher because they're processing life. They're doing life. They're looking at humanity and how they engage with it, how they walk out their journey. And so I think it's really important in our society today that we look at our kids and we say we need to teach these skills. We need to teach critical thinking and ideation and innovation, and all that comes from a centralized hub. Idea comes from philosophy. Ideation and innovation comes from philosophy. These are all, you look at Steve Jobs, he lived these things. And so for you, if you were to say a big takeaway for us as a society and taking away from the book, what is the lesson we really need to learn to get to a healthier place in this space?
So I think you're absolutely right to say that everybody is a philosopher, whether they realize it or not. I'm encouraging people to kind of reconnect with the philosophers they were as kids, these kinds of like fearless thinkers who have lots of questions. partly because most adults are doing philosophy, but doing it poorly, right? If you're asking a question of like, what would be a good life for me, right? Like, should I switch jobs right now? Should I go after, should I go after economic security, or should I take the risk of building this thing that I'm passionate about? Like these kinds of like questions about how to be in the world, they're philosophical questions and questions that people have been thinking about for, hundreds or thousands of years, probably since there have been people have had these sorts of questions. And so what I most want to use Nasty Brutish in short for, my most hope comes out of it, is that it's an encouragement to slow down and to think about these things, whether it's like, how should I be in the world? Or to think about these things that maybe are mysterious to you, whether God exists, or there's a discussion in the book about like what moral courage consists in. What is it that makes some of us willing to say, sacrifice things for justice, and others are sort of more prone to keep their head down and avoid the conflict. What I really hope is that people will see both, that you don't need a degree in philosophy. You don't need to read any fancy works in, German or Greek in order to do this. That actually the kids around you are also struggling with these kinds of questions, and you'll have fun if you engage them, but you'll also have fun if you engage your friends. So I want to sort of, the goal of this book is to show people that philosophy is fun and funny, with the hopes that once they recognize that, then they'll stick with it, and it will help them with all of these other like bigger, more significant concerns that they've got in their lives.
Now you tell a story, and I want to close this segment of the show with this story. It's a story I've told over and over again, and it's the story of the universe, the question of the universe, and what your son said about how the universe ends and the edges of the universe. Can you share that story?
Yeah. So when Rex was 7, we were walking home from 2nd grade, and he told me that he said the universe is infinite. That was a weird thing for you to say, but also like, what makes you think so? I said, some scientists think that it's infinite, but other scientists think it's just really, really big, but finite, and we aren't sure yet. And he's like, no, it has to be infinite. So, well, why does it have to be infinite? And he tells me this story. He says, suppose you're in a spaceship and you take it all the way to the edge of the universe, and you're right there, and then you punch, and he kind of punches the air in front of him with his fist. He says, your hand has to go somewhere, right? And I said, well, what if it doesn't? He says, if it doesn't, then something's stopping it. So you're not at the edge yet. and I knew enough physics actually to know that this isn't a sound argument, right? And I showed him when I got home. I pulled out a balloon, blew up the balloon, and asked him like to imagine like an ant's walking around this balloon. Balloon is a finite space. The surface of the balloon is a finite space. Is he ever going to hit an edge? And, as Rex traced his finger around the balloon, he saw, no, he's not going to hit an edge. He's just going to get right back where he started. And some scientists think the universe might work like that it folds back on itself in the way a balloon does, so that if your spaceship traveled long enough, you'd end up back where you started. But I was talking to a philosopher of physics a few days later, and I said, hey, my kid made this argument, which I don't think is quite right, but it's pretty cool. And he says, oh, that argument's a really famous argument. It's first credited to this ancient Greek philosopher named Archytas, who lived before Socrates. Actually, is that true? Let's just say it's first credited to this ancient Greek philosopher who lived it's first credited to this ancient Greek philosopher Archytas, who lived thousands of years ago. But it recurs throughout history. The Roman poet and philosopher Lucretius made the argument, and even Isaac Newton was attracted to this argument. And it's just such a striking illustration of the claim that I want to advance about our kids, that they're asking really big questions and they're thinking in really clever, creative ways about them. Like this 7-year-old was bored at school thinking about the universe, and he came up with an argument that the universe that was infinite that Isaac Newton accepted. That's pretty cool.
I love that story. I've shared that story with a few people, and I think it's a good example of how we limit what we think our kids are able to reach for. And I just love that. And, it's a great book. You wrote it, it better than anyone else. How can people find and connect with it?
So you can buy it really anywhere. You can buy books, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, your local independent bookstore. Just hop on bookshop.org and you can direct the proceeds to your favorite local spot. And audiobooks, ebooks available in any way you want to digest it.
We'll put the links in the episode notes because I know a lot of people are going to be lazy. They're not going to type it in. Just click it, go get it, go watch, listen to it. Read it. It's a worthwhile read. It's a fascinating conversation. We're going to take a break. And when we come back, it is rapid fire questions. We'll be right back. Next week on Jumble Think, we are changing it up. We used to do these really cool episodes where I just gave you some practical tips on the journey of chasing ideas and dreams. Now, our tagline here at Jumble Think is the story of ideas. And ideas are built on story. There are some people that would even say that story is the beginning foundation for making ideas reality. Well, crafting a good story, telling your ideas or your dreams in a captivating way is a significant part of getting other people excited about what you're doing. So on our next episode, I'm going to give you some real easy but powerful tools that you can use to better communicate your story, your ideas, your dreams, your business. So make sure you come back next week and check out that episode. Now let's jump into rapid fire questions.
Levez seulement le bras pour mettre l'aiguille sur le disque. Mettez le contact. Reposez votre bras.
We're back with Scott. Are you ready for rapid fire questions?
Absolutely.
As a child, what did you want to be when you grew up?
So, it's funny. I remember thinking when I was a kid that if I could find a job that consisted in thinking, that would be the job for me. I just like to lay around the house and think about things. And so somehow in life, I have stumbled into a job where my primary responsibility is to think about things. So I got the job I was after.
So good. What is one tip you'd give someone with a big idea or dream and they don't know where to start?
So I'm a kind of like work backwards person, right? Like what would it look like to be almost there? And then what would it look like to be almost at that point? And to sort of like break it up into bite-sized chunks by thinking about the process in reverse.
Love that. What is one change you'd like to see in the world?
So I'd really love to see people recognize that their kids are serious and sophisticated thinkers and that they're totally fun to have deep conversations about really any topic.
What do you want your legacy to be?
Can I give the same answer?
Yeah.
Maybe slightly broader. I want to get people more engaged in philosophy. I think that all of us had these curiosities as kids and loved thinking things through. And I'd like to help more adults make a little space for philosophy in their lives.
Where do you find inspiration?
In my kids. I never expected to write this book. It was just that I was having all these great conversations with my kids and then discovering that I could tell other people about these conversations and get them engaged in the same ideas and questions. Like when I was teaching, telling my students stories about my kids worked much better than sharing the abstract works of academic philosophy that we'd read. And so they've really, they've inspired me to think about a lot of questions differently, but they've also just inspired me to see that this activity is fun and engaging in a way that I didn't appreciate before.
Now, off the rapid fire questions for a second, but it does have to do with inspiration. What does Taylor Swift have to do with this book?
Oh, so, I wrote, actually, when we were pitching the book to various publishers, I wrote an op-ed about Taylor Swift and forgiveness. Yeah. She gave she gave an interview in which she commented on her long-running feud with Kanye West. Wait, was it Kanye?
Yeah,
it is. Okay. All of a sudden, I got worried. I confused the characters here. She gave this interview in which she said, in relation to her long-standing feud with Kanye West, she said, a lot of people say in our culture that you have to forgive to move on. And she said, that's not right. Sometimes you just become indifferent and you move on. And she had some really interesting thoughts about when you should forgive and when you shouldn't forgive. And there were a lot of resonances. There was a lot of resonance in what she had to say between important strands in the philosophical conversations about forgiveness and in Christian thought about forgiveness. And so the essay was called, well, in some versions of the paper, it was called The Wisdom of Taylor Swift. And in my preferred version, it was called Taylor Swift, Philosopher of Forgiveness. But I actually think she's a really talented philosopher of forgiveness.
Love that. What's one book you think every dreamer should read?
I always love still and recommend The Gingerbread Man, the kid's story.
Yeah.
Do you remember that? You remember The Gingerbread Man?
Yeah.
Yeah. Just because like he doesn't succeed in the end, like eventually he gets captured and eaten, but he lived a very big life for a gingerbread man, right? Like went well beyond what anybody would expect of him and just seemed to have the right attitude. The run as fast as you can. Can't catch me on the Gingerbread Man.
For you personally, how do you define success?
I struggle with that. In part because I sometimes wonder, right, like is success the state in which I should be interested in, right? And I think maybe it's a mistake to constantly be asking, am I succeeding at this? Am I failing at this? I try to think Aristotle said that people aim at what in Greek they call eudaimonia, right? Which sometimes translated as happiness, but really a better word for it is probably flourishing. And I think that's the kind of inquiry I'd rather ask about my own life. Not am I being successful in this or that, but in general, am I flourishing? Where there's going to be a lot of different components of that. Some related to family, some related to satisfaction at work, but to move away from an accomplishment focused perspective.
I love that because I think there's so much languishing going on in the world around us right now. To be in a place of flourishing would, I think for many people, be their ideal.
Yeah, for sure. It's a hard place to get right now.
Yeah, for sure. Our final rapid fire question for today is, what is one dream you're still wanting to fulfill in your own life?
I think it relates back to what I said before, like my hesitance in like giving you a rapid fire answer to like, what's the one dream. Is that I try to understand my life in a way that's not like goal oriented to do this particular thing or do that particular thing. So I think that for me, like the kind of project in my life right now is take this thing that I love, philosophy, and find a way to show more people the joy that comes with it and the benefits that come with it and get them engaged. And so I think I'm just at the beginning of that journey. So I'll say that the dream is to make some progress on that front.
Scott, it has been an honor to have you on the show. I love the book. It has just been, I think it's a fun conversation. I think our listeners will too, and I hope you did too.
This was a blast. It was really fun, and you come from a totally different perspective than a lot of other interviews I've done. I really enjoy getting to think about this stuff with you.
Once again, I want to thank Scott for joining us here on today's episode of Jumblethink. You can find his links in the episode notes. Make sure to check out the book and the other things that Scott is working on. Thank you so much for tuning into today's conversation. It means the world to me that you would listen, and I hope today's conversation has inspired you. Now, here's my challenge for you. Earlier on in the conversation, Scott shared the words wonder and curiosity. Have you taken time today to live a little bit in wonder of the world around you, or to be curious about what is challenging you? I encourage you. Take some time to live in wonder and curiosity. Take some time to explore the world around you. Take some time to be curious about things that you just usually write off. I hope you will do that today. Take some time. Be in wonder and curiosity. Thanks again for tuning into Jumblethink. Until next time, get out there, dream big, and change the world around you.
Étirez-vous doucement, mais complètement. En avant, en arrière, sur les côtés. Vous êtes une autre personne. Les mères de famille, les enfants peuvent c'est également prendre un moment revitalisant. Dans quelques mois, lorsque vous aurez bien saisi la technique et que vous serez maître de votre corps, vous pourrez vous décontracter même en travaillant.